Some destinies wait half a century for a single touch. For 50 years, no one had seen Prince Adrian Ashford open his eyes. Physicians had travelled across continents. Scholars had translated forgotten manuscripts. Ancient vampires had offered relics older than empires, and powerful witches had whispered blessings beneath blood-red moons. Nothing changed. Every sunrise found the prince exactly where he had been the night before, resting beneath layers of midnight velvet inside the eastern wing of Blackthorn Castle, as silent as a statue carved from pale marble. Over time, hope faded into routine. Servants polished the silver candelabras. Guards changed shifts without speaking above a whisper. Candles burned day and night beside the prince's chamber, not because anyone believed he would awaken, but because no one remembered a time when they had not. Even the great vampire king, Lucian Ashford, stopped asking for progress reports. He still visited his son every evening at precisely 9 o'clock, standing beside the bed for exactly 5 minutes before leaving without a word. 600 years had taught the king how to survive wars, betrayals, and impossible losses. They had never taught him how to watch his only child sleep through 50 endless years. On the opposite side of the castle, Evelyn Carter hurried through a narrow stone hallway with a basket of fresh linens balanced carefully against her hip. At 22, she had been working as a maid inside Blackthorn Castle for less than 4 months. She wasn't noble, she wasn't remarkable. She had grown up in a tiny farming town nearly 200 miles away, where people worried more about broken fences than immortal kings. After losing her parents, she accepted the only stable job she could find, cleaning rooms in the largest estate anyone had ever dared describe in whispers. Most days, no one even noticed she existed. That suited Evelyn just fine. Invisible people rarely made enemies. As she reached the eastern corridor, an older housekeeper suddenly appeared around the corner, looking flustered. "Evelyn," she said quickly, pressing a polished brass key into her hand. "The senior staff is busy preparing for tonight's council gathering. The prince's chamber still needs fresh linens. Be respectful. Don't touch anything you don't absolutely have to." Evelyn nodded immediately. "Yes, ma'am. And remember," the woman added, lowering her voice, "people say strange things happen in that room." Before Evelyn could ask what she meant, the housekeeper disappeared down another hallway. Evelyn looked at the heavy key resting in her palm. She had heard stories about the sleeping prince from other servants during quiet lunches in the kitchen. Most of them sounded impossible. Some claimed they heard a heartbeat echo through the walls every midnight. Others insisted flowers placed beside the bed never wilted. One cook even swore that snow fell outside the prince's window every winter, no matter what the weather looked like across the rest of the kingdom. Evelyn never believed rumors. She believed sheets needed changing because dust settled everywhere, even inside castles. The enormous oak door opened with a slow creak. A cool breath of air drifted past her face. The chamber felt untouched by time. Moonlight poured through towering stained-glass windows, painting silver patterns across polished stone floors. Shelves overflowed with ancient books whose leather bindings had faded long ago. White lilies rested in crystal vases, filling the room with a gentle fragrance. At the center stood an elegant bed surrounded by sheer black curtains. Prince Adrian lay perfectly still beneath embroidered blankets. He looked impossibly young, perhaps no older than 25, with dark hair resting neatly across the pillow and skin so pale it almost reflected the moonlight itself. He didn't resemble someone trapped by a curse. He resembled someone waiting for a dream to end. Evelyn quietly placed the clean linens on a nearby chair and began making the room presentable. She dusted shelves, straightened books, and carefully replaced fresh flowers beside the bed. Everything remained silent except the soft ticking of an antique grandfather clock standing against the far wall. Then she noticed the edge of the prince's blanket had slipped slightly from his shoulder. The room felt colder than before. "You'll probably be more comfortable like this," she whispered, speaking more to herself than to the sleeping prince. With gentle care, Evelyn reached forward to straighten the blanket. As her fingertips brushed against Prince Adrian's wrist for no more than a heartbeat, warmth rushed beneath her skin like sunlight breaking through winter clouds. Somewhere deep inside the castle, a bronze bell rang once, then again. Then every bell across Blackthorn Castle began ringing together. Evelyn froze. A faint golden light shimmered beneath the prince's skin, tracing delicate patterns along his hand before disappearing beneath his sleeve. She stepped backward, her pulse racing. The silence that followed felt impossibly heavy. Then, slowly, almost unbelievably, Prince Adrian Ashford drew the deepest breath he had taken in 50 years. His eyelashes trembled, his fingers moved, and for the first time since the curse had claimed him, the Vampire King's son opened his eyes. His silver gaze settled not on the ceiling, not on the ancient room around him, but directly on the frightened young maid standing beside his bed. His lips parted with the faintest hint of recognition, as though he had been searching across half a century for one face alone. Finally, he whispered softly, his voice barely louder than the wind beyond the stained glass windows. "I found you." No one moved. Evelyn stood frozen beside the bed, convinced she had somehow stepped into a dream that did not belong to her. The prince's silver eyes remained fixed on her with quiet certainty, not confusion, not fear, but recognition so deep it made her heartbeat echo in her ears. Before she could find the courage to answer, the castle erupted around them. Footsteps thundered through distant corridors. Doors opened one after another. Voices that had remained calm for decades suddenly carried unmistakable urgency. The bells continued to ring across Blackthorn Castle, their deep notes rolling through stone walls like waves across an endless sea. Evelyn instinctively stepped backward until the backs of her legs touched a carved wooden chair. "I think you have mistaken me for someone else," she whispered. "My name is Evelyn." Prince Adrian continued looking at her, blinking slowly as though the world itself felt unfamiliar. 50 years had passed in what must have seemed like a single moment. His breathing became steadier with every passing second, and color gradually returned to his pale face. Instead of answering immediately, his gaze wandered toward the moonlight, spilling through the stained glass before returning to Evelyn once more. "You are here," he said softly, almost to himself. Then it was true. Evelyn frowned. What was true? Before he could respond, the chamber doors swung open. Nearly a dozen royal guards entered first, their polished armor reflecting the candlelight. They stopped instantly when they saw the prince sitting upright against the headboard. None of them spoke. Even seasoned warriors who had protected the royal family for centuries seemed unable to believe what stood before them. One guard quietly lowered his sword until its tip rested against the floor. Another removed his helmet as though entering a sacred place. A heartbeat later, the royal physician hurried into the room carrying a leather medical case that slipped from his trembling hands the instant he looked up. Glass bottles rolled across the polished floor unnoticed. His lips parted, but no words came. Finally, one sentence escaped in a whisper. "He is awake." The room exploded into motion again. Messengers rushed away to summon the king. Advisors called for additional physicians. Servants hurried through hallways carrying candles and blankets despite no one asking for them. Evelyn remained exactly where she was, feeling smaller with every passing second. She wished she could quietly slip out the same door she had entered only minutes earlier. Instead, every pair of eyes slowly turned toward her. The royal physician approached carefully. "Young lady," he asked, "happened here?" Evelyn swallowed. "I changed the flowers, I dusted the shelves. The blanket had slipped, so I reached to straighten it. Did you perform a ritual? No. Did you recite an ancient prayer? No. Did you bring any relic into this room?" She slowly shook her head. "I only touched his wrist for a second." Silence settled once more. The physician exchanged uneasy glances with the guards. One elderly advisor quietly crossed himself while another stared at Evelyn as though seeing her for the first time. None of them appeared satisfied with such an ordinary answer. They had spent decades searching for impossible solutions. None of them knew how to accept a simple act of kindness. Prince Adrian watched the conversation without speaking. His expression remained calm, almost thoughtful, as though he remembered something no one else could see. Then his attention shifted toward the massive doors again. Every conversation stopped before anyone announced the visitor. The temperature inside the chamber seemed to drop by several degrees. King Lucian Ashford entered without hurry, dressed in a perfectly tailored black coat embroidered with silver thread. His dark hair framed a face that carried centuries of quiet authority. His pale complexion appeared almost luminous beneath the candlelight, and his grey eyes revealed nothing at first glance. Every guard immediately lowered their heads. Every servant stepped aside. No one dared breathe too loudly. The king ignored everyone else. His entire world narrowed to the young man sitting awake upon the bed. Father and son looked at one another across the silent chamber. 50 years disappeared between them without either speaking a single word. Lucian slowly crossed the room until he stood beside the bed. For the first time in living memory, those who served the royal family saw the ancient king hesitate. He lifted one hand, almost uncertain whether the moment before him was real, then gently rested it against Adrian's shoulder. The prince smiled faintly. "Good evening, father." The king closed his eyes for only a brief moment. It lasted less than a heartbeat, yet everyone present understood they had witnessed something deeply personal. When Lucian opened his eyes again, his voice remained calm, but it carried unmistakable warmth. "Welcome home, my son." Only then did the king turn toward Evelyn. His steady gaze settled on the frightened young maid standing quietly beside the chair, still clutching the folded blanket against her chest. He studied her face with careful attention, as though searching for answers hidden beyond ordinary sight. "What is your full name?" he asked. "Evelyn Carter, your majesty," she answered, lowering her eyes respectfully. "How long have you served in this castle?" "Almost 4 months." Lucian remained silent for several seconds. Then he spoke words that surprised every soul inside the chamber. "From this moment forward, Evelyn Carter will not leave Blackthorn Castle without my personal permission. She will receive royal protection, private quarters, and every courtesy owed to an honored guest." Shock spread across the room. Evelyn's heart sank instead of lifting. She had arrived that morning believing she would spend another ordinary day changing linens and polishing windows. By nightfall, the most powerful ruler in the vampire kingdom had quietly changed the course of her entire life. The celebration that spread through Blackthorn Castle did not reach Evelyn's heart. She followed 2 attendants through unfamiliar hallways lined with towering portraits and crystal lamps, each step making her feel farther away from the simple life she understood. Hours earlier, she had been worried about folded linens and polished silver. Now, every servant she passed lowered their eyes with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. Some smiled politely, others quietly stepped aside, whispering only after she had disappeared around the next corner. She knew they were not whispering about her. They were whispering about what had happened because of her. The guest suite prepared for Evelyn overlooked the eastern gardens, where ancient oak trees swayed beneath the moonlight. The room was larger than the farmhouse where she had grown up. Fresh flowers rested beside the fireplace. A tray filled with warm bread, fruit, tea, and honey waited untouched on the dining table. The soft bed looked more like a cloud than furniture. Instead of comfort, the room filled Evelyn with unease. She stood beside the window and looked toward the highest tower where Prince Adrian's chamber overlooked the valley below. "How can one touch change everything?" she whispered into the quiet night. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. An elderly woman entered carrying a neatly folded blue dress. Her silver hair was tied into a graceful bun, and kindness softened every line upon her face. "Good evening, Miss Carter," she said warmly. "My name is Margaret. I have served this family for almost 80 years. Evelyn smiled nervously. "It is nice to meet you." Margaret placed the dress across the foot of the bed. "His Majesty asked me to help you settle in. If you need anything, you only have to ask." Evelyn hesitated before speaking. "Can someone please explain what is happening? Everyone keeps looking at me as though I have done something impossible." Margaret remained quiet for a moment before taking a slow seat near the fireplace. "Perhaps because you have." Evelyn shook her head immediately. "That is exactly why everyone is confused," Margaret replied with a gentle smile. "For 50 years the kingdom searched for extraordinary answers, ancient magic, rare bloodlines, forgotten relics. No one expected kindness to accomplish what power could not." Evelyn lowered her eyes. "He looked at me like he already knew me." Margaret's smile slowly faded. "Did he truly?" Evelyn nodded. "The first thing he said was that he had found me." The older woman folded her hands together thoughtfully. "Then His Majesty's concerns are understandable." "Concerns?" Evelyn asked softly. Margaret looked toward the closed door before lowering her voice. "You should know something about Prince Adrian. Before the curse claimed him, people said he often dreamed of places he had never visited and faces he had never met. Sometimes those dreams came true years later." Evelyn stared at her without speaking. "The royal family never discussed those stories publicly," Margaret continued. "Most believe they were only legends told by palace servants. Tonight, I am no longer certain." The room grew quiet again until another knock echoed from outside. This time the visitor wore dark, formal robes embroidered with the royal crest. He bowed respectfully before speaking. "Miss Carter, His Majesty requests your presence in the royal library." Only minutes later, Evelyn found herself walking through one of the oldest wings of the castle. Towering shelves stretched nearly 40 feet toward a painted ceiling where stars and constellations shimmered beneath candlelight. Thousands of books rested in perfect order. At the center of the vast room stood King Lucian beside a long oak table covered with ancient journals and faded maps. Prince Adrian sat nearby, wrapped in a dark wool cloak while the royal physician quietly examined him from a respectful distance. The prince looked stronger already, though traces of weariness still softened his movements. As Evelyn entered, Adrian immediately lifted his eyes toward her. Once again, that unmistakable expression of recognition appeared upon his face. Lucian noticed it as well. "Please sit, Miss Carter," the king said calmly. Evelyn obeyed without question. Lucian opened a weathered leather journal whose pages had yellowed with age. "There is something I have never shared outside the royal family," he began. 49 years ago, only months after Adrian fell into his endless sleep, he spoke exactly 3 sentences before losing consciousness completely. Evelyn listened carefully. The first was, "Do not search for the cure." The king slowly turned another page. The second was, "She will come when hope is gone." Evelyn felt a chill travel through her arms. Lucian's steady voice grew even quieter. "The third sentence was written here by my own hand because I feared I might one day believe I imagined it." His finger rested upon faded ink that had survived half a century. Adrian looked toward Evelyn with complete certainty. Lucian read the final words aloud. "When I awaken, the first face I see will be the one destiny has protected for me." Silence settled over the library. The fire crackled softly in the enormous stone hearth. Somewhere beyond the tall windows, an owl called into the night. Evelyn could not find a single word to answer. She had arrived at Blackthorn Castle believing destiny belonged only to kings and legends. Now an ancient prophecy appeared to be looking directly back at her. Morning arrived beneath a sky the color of polished silver. But Blackthorn Castle did not awaken with its usual quiet rhythm. News of the prince's return had already traveled beyond the castle walls. Messengers rode toward distant provinces before sunrise. Noble houses requested immediate audiences. Ancient vampire elders abandoned decades of isolation and began their journeys back to the royal court. Inside the castle, every corridor carried the same question spoken in different voices. Who was Evelyn Carter? Evelyn asked herself the very same question as she stood alone in the library after King Lucian quietly dismissed everyone except his son. The prophecy echoed through her thoughts again and again. She had never met Prince Adrian before yesterday. She had never even heard the Ashford family mentioned outside stories told by travelers passing through her hometown. Yet the words written almost 50 years earlier described her arrival with impossible precision. "Your Majesty," she finally said, "there has to be another explanation." Lucian gently closed the ancient journal. "I have spent half a century searching for one." His calm voice carried neither excitement nor fear. "If another explanation exists, I would welcome it." Adrian slowly rose from his chair. Although the physician immediately stepped closer, ready to assist, the prince smiled reassuringly and walked across the room under his own strength. His movements remained careful, but every step appeared steadier than the last. He stopped beside one of the tall windows overlooking the eastern gardens. Morning light rested across his pale face, giving him an almost timeless appearance. "The dreams were never completely clear," he said quietly while watching birds circle above the ancient oak trees. "Most felt like scattered pieces of someone else's memories." Evelyn listened carefully. But one face always remained the same. He turned toward her with gentle certainty. "Yours." She lowered her eyes almost immediately. "That cannot be possible." "I used to think the same thing," Adrian answered with a faint smile. "When I was a child, I described a young woman carrying fresh flowers through endless hallways. Father believed I had imagined her because the castle employed hundreds of servants over the centuries." Lucian remained silent. The memory clearly belonged to him as well. Adrian continued, "As I grew older, the dreams changed. I saw snow falling outside a farmhouse. I saw an old wooden bridge beside a river. I heard someone humming while baking bread. Looked up in surprise. Grandmother always hummed while baking." Adrian's expression softened. "I know." The room became perfectly still. Evelyn felt as though invisible threads had quietly connected moments separated by decades. None of it made sense, yet each new detail somehow felt impossible to dismiss. Before anyone could speak again, the library doors opened. A tall gentleman wearing dark green robes entered with respectful composure. His silver hair framed a thoughtful face marked by age rather than weakness. He carried several leather scroll cases beneath one arm. "Your Majesty," he said with a formal bow. "The council is assembled earlier than expected." Lucian nodded. "Thank you, Chancellor Rowan." Rowan's wise eyes briefly settled upon Evelyn. Unlike many others, he showed no suspicion, only curiosity. "May I ask one question, Miss Carter?" Evelyn nodded politely. "When you touched the prince yesterday, what were you thinking?" She blinked, surprised by the simplicity of the question. "Nothing extraordinary." Rowan waited patiently. "I only noticed that his blanket had slipped," Evelyn answered honestly. The room felt cold. And I thought no one should have to sleep that way. The elderly chancellor exchanged a quiet glance with the king before speaking almost to himself, compassion without expectation. Lucian folded his hands behind his back. You believe that matters? Rowan smiled gently. Sometimes the oldest magic does not answer power, sometimes it answers character. Adrian looked toward Evelyn again. That sounds familiar. Rowan carefully opened one of the scroll cases and unrolled a faded parchment across the oak table. Elegant handwriting covered its surface in flowing lines of ancient script. This document was copied nearly 700 years ago, Rowan explained. It speaks of a forgotten covenant established before the vampire kingdoms were united. Evelyn studied the page even though she could not read a single symbol. Rowan translated aloud. When pride cannot break the darkness, kindness shall become the key. The hand that seeks nothing shall open the door that strength cannot move. No one spoke for several long moments. The words seemed to settle into the room like falling snow. Lucian slowly looked toward the parchment, then toward Evelyn. For 50 years we searched with power, he said quietly. Perhaps we never searched the way we should have. Before the conversation could continue, a distant horn echoed across the castle grounds. Another answered from the western gate. Then a third sounded from the northern watchtower. Chancellor Rowan looked toward the windows. The noble houses have arrived sooner than expected. The warmth inside the library seemed to fade. Lucian's calm expression remained unchanged, but his voice grew noticeably firmer. They will not all celebrate Adrian's return. Rowan gave a slow nod. Some will question why an ordinary human maid stands at the center of a prophecy older than their family lines. Adrian stepped beside Evelyn without hesitation. Then they may ask their questions. He met his father's eyes with quiet confidence, but she will not face them alone. The great council chamber had not welcomed every noble house at the same time in nearly a century. Before noon, elegant black carriages filled the castle courtyard while sleek modern vehicles lined the outer gates, blending ancient tradition with the present day. Vampire lords, duchesses, scholars, and royal advisors stepped through the towering entrance beneath banners embroidered with the silver crest of House Ashford. Some had crossed thousands of miles overnight after hearing the impossible news. Others arrived simply because they refused to believe it. Inside the castle, servants moved quietly between marble hallways carrying tea, polished crystals, and stacks of official records. Every conversation eventually returned to the same question. Who was the human girl? Evelyn remained in a private sitting room beside the library while Margaret helped her exchange her simple maid uniform for a modest navy blue dress. It was beautifully tailored yet intentionally plain compared to the elaborate clothing worn by the royal court. Evelyn looked at her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized herself. I do not belong here, she admitted softly. Margaret adjusted the sleeve with a reassuring smile. Sometimes people belong somewhere long before they realize it. Evelyn shook her head. I am still the same person who was changing bed sheets yesterday. Exactly, Margaret answered. Nothing about your heart has changed. Perhaps that is why all of this happened. A quiet knock interrupted them. Chancellor Rowan entered carrying another weathered journal beneath his arm. His Majesty asks that Miss Carter remain here until the council has been addressed. Evelyn nodded. Will they truly argue over what happened? Rowan gave a thoughtful smile. Power often asks questions before gratitude has a chance to speak. After Margaret quietly excused herself, Rowan placed the journal upon a nearby table. May I tell you something I have never shared outside the royal archives? Evelyn looked surprised. Of course. Rowan slowly opened the brittle pages. Handwritten observations filled every margin, recorded by generations of royal historians. When Prince Adrian was very young, he possessed an unusual gift. He remembered dreams with astonishing detail. Evelyn listened quietly. He once described flowers blooming during the middle of winter. Rowan gently turned another page. 3 years later, those flowers appeared after an unexpected warm front. Another page revealed faded sketches. He described a comet crossing the northern sky. Rowan smiled faintly. 8 years later, they apologized. Evelyn stared at the drawings. You think his dreams were never dreams? I believe they were glimpses of possibilities, Rowan replied. Not certainties. Possibilities waiting for choices to shape them. Evelyn slowly lowered her eyes toward the journal. Then why would I appear in them? Rowan answered honestly. That is the one question none of us can answer. At that very moment, The distant sound of voices echoed through the hallway. The council session had begun. Inside the grand chamber, King Lucian stood upon the raised platform beneath towering stained glass windows, while representatives of every noble family filled the semicircle below. Prince Adrian remained beside his father, standing with calm dignity despite only awakening the previous day. Many nobles watched him with genuine relief. Others appeared more interested in the mystery surrounding the human maid than the miracle of the prince's recovery. An elderly noblewoman wearing an elegant crimson gown stepped forward first. "Your Majesty," she said respectfully. "The kingdom rejoices at the prince's return, yet many families seek clarity regarding the circumstances." Lucian inclined his head. "You may ask." Another lord rose from his seat. "Every physician failed, every relic failed, every ritual failed. Then an unknown human servant succeeded by accident. Surely there must be more to the story." Murmurs spread through the chamber. Lucian answered without hesitation. "If there is more, we have not yet discovered it." A younger noble folded his hands. "Then perhaps the girl possesses hidden abilities." Adrian calmly stepped forward before his father replied. "If kindness is now considered a hidden ability, then perhaps we should all examine ourselves before examining her." Silence swept through the chamber. Several elders quietly exchanged thoughtful glances. Chancellor Rowan entered moments later and approached the royal platform. "Your Majesty," he announced, "the Eastern Archives have completed a preliminary search." Lucian accepted the report. "Read it aloud." Rowan opened the document. "Birth records, education records, employment history, and family history have all been verified. Evelyn Carter was born in Ashbrook, Colorado. She was raised by her parents until their passing, after which she lived with her grandmother, Helen Carter. No criminal record, no noble ancestry, no unexplained disappearances, no connection to any royal bloodline." The chamber grew remarkably quiet. The report contained exactly what no one expected, nothing extraordinary. One elderly duchess slowly smiled. Then perhaps the extraordinary thing was never her past. Every face turned toward the speaker. She continued gently, "Perhaps it was simply who she chose to become." Lucian looked across the gathered council before speaking in a voice calm enough to silence every whisper. "Until evidence suggests otherwise, Evelyn Carter will be treated not as a suspect, not as a curiosity, but as a guest under my protection." No one challenged the decree, yet as the meeting continued, several nobles quietly exchanged cautious looks. Beyond the towering windows, dark clouds gathered above the distant mountains, although the morning forecast had promised clear skies. Prince Adrian noticed them first. A strange expression crossed his face, one that neither relief nor happiness could explain. He stared toward the horizon as though recognizing something approaching long before anyone else could see it. Prince Adrian did not speak again until the council meeting had ended. Even after the nobles slowly departed the chamber, his eyes remained fixed on the mountains beyond the eastern windows, where dark clouds continued gathering with unusual speed. The afternoon sunlight faded behind them, leaving long shadows across the castle courtyard. Evelyn noticed the change the moment Margaret escorted her toward the royal garden for fresh air. Only yesterday the grounds had seemed peaceful, filled with blooming roses and carefully trimmed hedges. Today even the birds had disappeared from the ancient trees. "The castle feels different," Evelyn said quietly. Margaret nodded without looking up. "Blackthorn Castle has always reflected the emotions of the royal bloodline. When the king grieves, winter lingers longer. When hope returns, the gardens bloom early." Evelyn looked across the flower beds where white lilies gently swayed despite the absence of any noticeable breeze. "Then why does everything suddenly feel so heavy?" Before Margaret could answer, Chancellor Rowan approached from a nearby stone pathway. His thoughtful expression carried the same quiet concern that Evelyn had seen growing throughout the day. "His Royal Highness wishes to walk through the gardens," Rowan explained. "He specifically requested that Miss Carter accompany him." Margaret smiled gently before stepping aside. "I believe that is becoming a familiar request." A few moments later, Adrian entered the garden wearing a dark wool coat instead of his ceremonial clothing. Without the formal robes, he appeared less like a legendary prince and more like an ordinary young man trying to understand a world that had continued without him for half a century. He paused beside a stone fountain where clear water flowed in peaceful circles. "Everything is smaller than I remember," he said with a faint smile. Evelyn looked around in surprise. "The gardens?" Adrian nodded. "When I was a child, these trees felt as tall as mountains." Evelyn smiled for the first time that day. "I think every place feels smaller when we grow older." Adrian looked toward her with quiet appreciation. "You always answer with simple truths." They walked slowly beneath rows of flowering arches while royal guards followed from a respectful distance. Neither of them hurried to fill the silence. It felt comfortable, as though conversation was not required. Finally, Adrian stopped beside an old stone bench overlooking a peaceful lake. "There is something I remember clearly," he said, "not from before the curse. From during it." Evelyn listened without interrupting. "People assume I was asleep." He shook his head gently. "I was trapped between dreams and time. I could hear distant voices sometimes, father's voice, the physician's, rain against the windows." He looked toward the calm surface of the lake, and every so often I heard another voice. "Mine?" Adrian smiled softly. "Not exactly. More like an echo waiting to become yours." Before Evelyn could respond, a young castle attendant hurried across the garden carrying a folded letter sealed with black wax. He bowed respectfully before presenting it to Chancellor Rowan, who had remained nearby. Rowan broke the seal, read only the first few lines, and his expression immediately became serious. King Lucian arrived moments later, having clearly been summoned without delay. "What has happened?" the king asked calmly. Rowan handed him the letter. "The Western watch stations have reported unusual activity." Lucian read silently before folding the paper. "The border villages." Rowan nodded. "Nothing dangerous, only unusual." Evelyn glanced between them. "What does that mean?" Lucian answered honestly. "People have begun reporting the same dream." Adrian slowly turned toward his father. "How many?" "More than 100 before noon," Rowan replied. "The number continues growing." Evelyn felt an unexpected chill despite the mild afternoon air. "The same dream?" Rowan nodded. "According to every report, strangers who have never met each other described standing before Blackthorn Castle while every window shines with golden light. They all see the same young woman walking through the front gate carrying white lilies." Evelyn instinctively looked toward the nearby flower beds filled with those very blossoms. "That cannot be a coincidence," Adrian whispered. Lucian remained perfectly composed, but his steady gaze settled upon Evelyn once more. "Describe the woman," he asked Rowan. The Chancellor slowly unfolded another page attached to the report. "Brown hair, blue eyes, simple blue dress, no jewelry, carrying fresh lilies." Evelyn quietly looked down at the navy dress Margaret had chosen only hours earlier. No one spoke. Even the gentle sound of the fountain seemed to fade into the background. Adrian finally broke the silence. "The dreams are spreading now." Lucian nodded once. "Which means whatever began yesterday did not end when you awakened." A cool wind suddenly swept across the garden, carrying dozens of white lily petals into the air. They circled Evelyn for only a brief moment before drifting toward the eastern tower, where the prince had slept for 50 years. Every guard watched in silent amazement. Margaret slowly crossed herself. Rowan closed his eyes as though remembering words from an ancient book. Adrian simply smiled with quiet certainty. "The castle remembers her," he said softly. And somewhere deep beneath Blackthorn Castle, hidden far below its oldest foundations, an ancient bell rang once, although no human hand had touched it in centuries. That single bell changed the atmosphere of Blackthorn Castle more than the prince's awakening had. Servants who had worked there for decades quietly stopped what they were doing and listened. The sound had come from somewhere no living employee had ever entered. Deep beneath the oldest foundation rested the Hall of Origins, a place spoken of only in royal records and forgotten legends. No one had heard its bell in more than 400 years. King Lucius remained perfectly still for several moments before speaking. "Seal the lower archives," he instructed calmly. "No one enters the Hall of Origins until I give the order." The royal guards bowed without hesitation and disappeared through separate corridors with remarkable speed. Evelyn watched the sudden activity with growing uncertainty. "What is beneath the castle?" she asked softly. Chancellor Rowan answered before the king could. "The oldest history of our kingdom." He paused thoughtfully. "And perhaps the oldest secrets." Adrian continued watching the eastern tower where the drifting lily petals had finally settled. His expression became distant, as though he were listening to a memory no one else could hear. "I remember that bell," he said quietly. Lucian immediately turned toward him. "From before the curse?" Adrian slowly shook his head. "No, from inside the dreams." Silence settled once again. Rowan's eyes widened. "You never mentioned hearing a bell." Adrian frowned with quiet concentration. "I did not remember until now." He closed his eyes for only a moment. Every time it rang, someone was standing before a doorway covered with silver vines. I could never see their face because sunlight was behind them. Evelyn felt an unexpected chill. Was it a man or a woman? Adrian opened his eyes and looked directly at her. "I always thought it was only a shadow." His voice softened. "Now I am not so certain." Before anyone could continue, another messenger hurried into the garden carrying a leather portfolio filled with handwritten reports. He stopped respectfully before King Lucian. "Your Majesty, additional messages have arrived from the northern and southern provinces." Lucian accepted the portfolio and handed it directly to Rowan. The Chancellor quickly reviewed the pages before looking up with unmistakable concern. "The dreams are no longer limited to the border villages." Evelyn folded her hands together. "How far have they spread?" Rowan looked toward the map carved into the nearby stone wall. "Nearly every region under the Ashford crown has reported them." Adrian quietly asked, "Are the details still identical?" Rowan nodded. "Every witness describes the same woman carrying white lilies toward the castle gates. There is only one difference." Lucian raised an eyebrow. "Continue." Rowan turned another page. "The newer reports claim she is no longer walking alone." Evelyn felt her heartbeat quicken. "Who is with her?" Rowan looked toward Adrian before answering. "A young man wearing a black coat with a silver crest." Adrian smiled faintly. "Me." No one questioned the conclusion. The coincidence had become too precise to dismiss. Margaret, who had quietly remained nearby throughout the conversation, suddenly spoke for the first time. "My grandmother used to tell me something when I was a little girl." Everyone looked toward her. She smiled almost apologetically. "I always assumed it was nothing more than an old bedtime story." Lucian nodded politely. "Please continue." Margaret looked toward the white lilies surrounding the fountain. "She said that when destiny finally finds the people it has been searching for, the kingdom dreams before the people understand why." Rowan slowly lowered the reports in his hands. "I have read something similar." He looked thoughtfully toward the castle. "The oldest legends often describe dreams as invitations rather than warnings." Evelyn struggled to understand everything unfolding around her. "Why would complete strangers dream about me? I have never met any of them." Lucian answered with complete honesty. "That is exactly why we must be careful. Fear grows easily around things people cannot explain." Adrian stepped closer to Evelyn, his expression remaining calm despite the uncertainty surrounding them. "Do not let their questions change who you are." Evelyn managed a small smile. "That sounds easier than it." Softly, the warm sound surprising everyone nearby. Several guards quietly exchanged glances. None of them could remember hearing the prince laugh. "Then we shall learn together," he replied. The peaceful moment lasted only seconds before another unexpected sound drifted through the gardens. This time it was not a bell, it was music, very faint, almost carried by the wind itself. Evelyn instinctively turned toward the eastern wing. Margaret nodded slowly. Rowan listened carefully. Even Lucian remained perfectly still. Somewhere inside the castle, a piano was playing a gentle melody unlike anything anyone present recognized. Adrian's face suddenly filled with astonishment. "Impossible," he whispered. "That song." Lucian looked at his son with unusual intensity. "You know it?" Adrian nodded slowly without taking his eyes off the distant tower. "I heard it every time the dreams ended." He looked toward Evelyn with quiet certainty. "And I have never heard it in the waking world until this very moment." Without another word, Adrian began walking toward the eastern wing. Evelyn instinctively followed. Lucian and Rowan exchanged one silent glance before following them as well, because every instinct told the ancient king that whatever waited at the end of that mysterious melody had been waiting almost as long as his son had slept. The melody grew clearer with every step, floating through the silent corridors like a memory that refused to disappear. It was gentle, almost comforting, yet every note carried a strange familiarity that settled deep inside Evelyn's heart, even though she knew with absolute certainty she had never heard it before. Prince Adrian walked ahead without hesitation, following the music as though he already knew where it would lead. King Lucian, Chancellor Rowan, Margaret, and several royal guards followed at a respectful distance, but no one dared interrupt the silence. The eastern wing had remained almost untouched during the prince's long sleep. Dust rested upon carved window frames that no servant had polished in years. Portraits of forgotten ancestors lined the walls beneath crystal sconces whose candles flickered without any noticeable breeze. The music finally stopped before an elegant wooden door decorated with silver vines curling around a single blooming lily. Adrian froze the moment he saw it. His breathing became slow and measured. Rowan looked carefully at the carvings. "This chamber has been sealed for generations." Lucian studied the old brass handle. "It belonged to Queen Isabella, your wife." Lucian gave a quiet nod. "Adrian's mother." Margaret lowered her eyes respectfully. "No one has entered her music room since the night the prince fell asleep." Evelyn looked back at the closed door in disbelief. Then who was playing the piano? No one answered because no one could. Lucian stepped forward and slowly turned the handle. The lock clicked open with surprising ease, as though someone had unlocked it only moments earlier. The door moved inward without resistance. Warm afternoon sunlight poured through tall windows overlooking the eastern valley. A polished grand piano rested beside them, its ivory keys perfectly still. Fresh white lilies stood in crystal vases throughout the room despite no servant remembering placing them there. Shelves filled with sheet music remained untouched by dust. It looked less like an abandoned room and more like someone had simply stepped outside for a short walk. Evelyn quietly entered last. The peaceful atmosphere wrapped around her immediately. Without thinking, she walked toward the piano and noticed a single piece of handwritten music resting on the stand. The title had faded with age, but one line remained perfectly clear. "For the day hope returns." Adrian slowly approached the instrument, his fingers lightly brushing the polished wood. "This was my mother's favorite melody." His voice trembled ever so slightly. "She played it every birthday." Lucian remained silent beside the window. For the first time since Evelyn had met him, the ancient king looked less like an immortal ruler and more like a husband remembering someone deeply missed. Rowan carefully examined the room. No footprints, no signs that anyone has entered. Margaret quietly folded her hands. "Yet the flowers are fresh." Evelyn looked down at the handwritten music again. Something caught her attention near the bottom corner of the page. There, almost hidden beneath the faded ink, was a small sentence written in elegant cursive. She leaned closer and softly read the words aloud. "When the song returns, trust the girl who remembers kindness before power." The room fell completely silent. Rowan immediately stepped beside her. "Read that again." Evelyn repeated every word exactly as written. Rowan's eyes widened. "That sentence does not appear in the official copies of the Queen's compositions." Lucian slowly crossed the room until he stood beside the piano. He carefully examined the handwriting before closing his eyes for a brief moment. "It is hers," he said quietly. "I would recognize Isabella's writing anywhere." Adrian turned toward his father. "She left us a message." Before Lucian could respond, one of the royal guards entered carrying another sealed letter. "Your Majesty," he said respectfully, "the council requests an emergency audience." Lucian accepted the message and quickly scanned its contents. His calm expression remained unchanged, but Rowan immediately noticed the subtle shift in his eyes. "Bad news?" the Chancellor asked. Lucian folded the letter. "Not yet." He looked toward Evelyn. "Have submitted the same request." Evelyn felt a knot form in her stomach. "What request?" Lucian answered without hesitation. "They wish to meet you personally." Margaret quietly sighed. "That was sooner than I expected." Adrian stepped beside Evelyn with quiet confidence. They believe seeing her will answer their questions. Rowan gently shook his head. "Or create even more." Outside the windows, the clouds that had gathered over the mountains finally reached the castle. Soft rain began falling across the gardens, tapping gently against the glass while the room remained strangely peaceful. Evelyn looked once more at the handwritten message resting above the piano keys. The final words echoed inside her thoughts. Kindness before power. They sounded simple, yet somehow they felt older than the castle itself. As everyone prepared to leave the music room, Evelyn glanced back one last time. Without anyone touching the instrument, a single piano key quietly pressed itself down. One clear note filled the room before fading into silence, and tucked beneath the music stand, barely visible in the fading afternoon light, rested a small ivory key engraved with the same silver lily that appeared on the mysterious doorway. The rain continued falling as the royal party returned from the forgotten music room, but not a single drop seemed ordinary anymore. Every sound inside Blackthorn Castle carried new meaning. Every quiet hallway felt as though it had awakened alongside the prince. Evelyn walked beside Margaret in thoughtful silence while the small ivory key rested carefully inside a velvet pouch. Chancellor Rowan had entrusted to King Lucian. No one attempted to explain why it had appeared beneath the piano. No one could. By the time they reached the Grand Council chamber, every seat had been filled once again. Representatives from the oldest vampire houses waited with remarkable patience, their attention shifting immediately toward the young woman entering behind the king. Some greeted her with respectful nods, others simply observed without revealing their thoughts. King Lucian took his place before the assembly while Adrian remained at his right side. Evelyn quietly stood several steps behind them, wishing she could disappear into the polished stone walls. Lucian's steady voice carried effortlessly across the chamber. "Several members of this council requested an audience with Miss Carter. You may now speak." An elderly lord with silver hair rose first. "Your Majesty, we extend our gratitude for allowing this meeting. Our concern is not with the young lady herself, but with understanding what destiny appears to be asking of this kingdom." Lucian inclined his head. "A reasonable question." A respected duchess followed. "Miss Carter, may I ask you something directly?" "Of course. When all of this began, what did you hope to gain?" Evelyn looked genuinely surprised. "Nothing." The duchess smiled gently. "Not even recognition?" Evelyn slowly shook her head. "I only wanted to do my job well enough to keep it." Quiet murmurs spread across the chamber. The answer had been so simple that it seemed to catch everyone off guard. Another noble stood. "If His Majesty offered you wealth beyond imagination tomorrow, would it change who you are?" Evelyn thought for only a moment. "It would help me care for people who once cared for me. But it would not change who I want to become." The chamber fell silent again. Chancellor Rowan quietly observed every reaction. He noticed something unexpected. Each honest answer seemed to ease the tension rather than increase it. The questions gradually became less suspicious and more personal. One elderly scholar adjusted his glasses before speaking. "Miss Carter, what frightened you most when you first entered the prince's chamber?" Evelyn smiled faintly, making a mistake. Soft laughter echoed throughout the room. Even Adrian smiled. "Not the prince?" the scholar asked. "No," Evelyn answered honestly. He looked lonely, not frightening. Several nobles lowered their eyes in quiet reflection. Lucian himself remained completely still, yet something warm briefly softened his expression. The discussion continued until a deep voice echoed from the rear of the chamber. "Kindness is admirable." Every head turned toward the speaker. Lord Cassian Thorne, one of the oldest nobles in the kingdom, slowly stepped forward. His appearance remained elegant, his tone respectful, yet his eyes carried careful caution. "But kingdoms cannot be governed by emotion alone." The room became noticeably quieter. Cassian continued calmly. "No one questions Miss Carter's character. However, extraordinary events require extraordinary certainty. Prophecies have misled kingdoms before." Rowan watched Lucian carefully, expecting a response. Instead, Adrian spoke first. "What certainty do you seek?" Cassian folded his hands. "Whether destiny truly chose her, or whether we are interpreting coincidence as fate." Evelyn lowered her eyes. She could not blame him. If their positions had been reversed, she might have asked the same question. Before anyone else could answer, another palace attendant hurried into the chamber carrying a sealed envelope marked with the Royal Observatory crest. He bowed respectfully before presenting it to Chancellor Rowan. Rowan quickly opened the report. His thoughtful expression slowly transformed into quiet astonishment. "Your Majesty," he said softly, "the astronomers request permission to address the council immediately." Lucian nodded once. Moments later, the chief astronomer entered carrying several detailed star charts. He spread them carefully across the long council table. "We observed an unusual celestial event beginning shortly after the prince awakened," he explained. "The northern constellation known as the Silver Lily has shifted." Several nobles exchanged puzzled glances. "Constellations do not shift," one whispered. "Normally they do not," the astronomer replied. He pointed toward a carefully drawn diagram. "Yet for the first time in recorded history, the final star now aligns directly above Blackthorn Castle." Rowan leaned closer to examine the chart. "When did this alignment begin?" "Within minutes of the prince opening his eyes." Silence settled once more. Cassian looked from the charts toward Evelyn. His expression no longer carried doubt alone, it carried uncertainty. Lucian slowly rose from his chair. "The council sought evidence beyond rumor. Today we have witnessed the prince's return, ancient messages, shared dreams across the kingdom, and now even the heavens themselves have changed." His calm voice filled every corner of the chamber. "Whatever this mystery may become, Miss Evelyn Carter will face it under my protection, and any question directed toward her will first be directed toward the crown." No one challenged the declaration. Beyond the towering stained glass windows, the rain finally stopped. A single beam of late afternoon sunlight broke through the clouds and illuminated the castle courtyard below, where white lilies had unexpectedly begun blooming between the ancient stone pathways that only hours earlier had been completely bare. Evening settled gently over Blackthorn Castle, wrapping its towers in amber light while the last traces of rain disappeared from the gardens below. The unexpected lilies continued blooming between ancient stone paths, and no gardener could explain why flowers that normally required weeks had appeared within a single afternoon. Servants paused to admire them before quietly returning to their duties, speaking in hushed voices as though the castle itself had become something sacred. Inside the royal library, King Lucian, Prince Adrian, Chancellor Rowan and Evelyn gathered around an enormous table covered with journals, maps, and carefully preserved family records. The ivory key rested at the center beside the faded sheet music recovered from Queen Isabella's chamber. No one had touched it since leaving the music room. Rowan carefully adjusted a brass reading lamp and unfolded another collection of documents retrieved from the deepest royal archives. "If the Queen left us a message," he said thoughtfully, "there is a strong possibility she left more than one." Lucian nodded. "Search everything connected to Isabella's final years." Rowan opened a leather-bound ledger filled with notes written in several different hands across decades. Most pages contained routine observations about royal ceremonies, diplomatic visits, and seasonal harvests. Then one paragraph caught his attention. The handwriting belonged to Queen Isabella herself. Rowan read aloud, "The kingdom believes strength alone preserves peace. I have learned otherwise. There may come a day when our family survives not because of power, but because an ordinary heart refuses to stop being kind." Evelyn slowly lowered her eyes. The words sounded strangely familiar after everything that had happened. Adrian quietly smiled. "She always believed compassion was a greater teacher than fear." Lucian looked toward the old journal with unmistakable affection. That belief often made others underestimate her. Rowan carefully turned another page. Tucked between two sheets rested drawn in delicate charcoal. He carefully unfolded it across the table. Everyone leaned closer. The drawing showed a young woman standing beside blooming lilies outside Blackthorn Castle. Her features were unfinished, but several details immediately stood out. A simple blue dress, brown hair resting over one shoulder, a basket of fresh flowers in her hands. Evelyn instinctively stepped backward. "That looks—" She could not finish the sentence. Adrian completed it quietly. "Like you." Rowan examined the corner of the drawing where Isabella had signed her initials beside a short handwritten note. "She arrives carrying no crown, no title, and no ambition beyond kindness." Lucian remained silent for several moments before asking the question everyone had been avoiding. How could Isabella have drawn someone she never met? No one answered because no answer seemed possible. The room remained quiet until Evelyn noticed something unusual. The ivory key lying on the table reflected the lamplight differently than before. A faint silver glow slowly traced the engraved lily across its surface. "Your Majesty," she whispered. Every eye turned toward the key. The soft glow lasted only a few seconds before fading again. Adrian gently reached toward it but stopped just short of touching it. "It reacted when she noticed it," he observed. Rowan looked thoughtfully toward Evelyn. "Perhaps it has been waiting for someone to recognize it." Lucian considered the possibility before giving a quiet nod. "Miss Carter, would you please pick it up?" Evelyn hesitated only briefly before reaching forward. The small ivory key felt unexpectedly warm in her hand, almost as though it had been resting in sunlight. Nothing dramatic happened. No bright light filled the room. No ancient voices echoed through the castle. Instead, a peaceful feeling settled over the library, gentle enough that everyone noticed it at once. The crackling fireplace became calmer. The restless wind outside the windows seemed to disappear. Even the candle flame stood perfectly still. Adrian closed his eyes for a brief moment and smiled. The dreams always felt like this just before they ended. Rowan slowly opened another forgotten journal that had remained closed throughout the evening. A loose page slipped free and drifted onto the table. He picked it up with careful hands. It contained only one sentence written in Queen Isabella's graceful handwriting. "When the final key chooses its keeper, the hidden door will no longer wait." Lucian looked toward Rowan. "Hidden door?" Rowan nodded slowly. "The Hall of Origins." Silence settled across the room once again. Every clue they had uncovered seemed to point toward the same forgotten place beneath the castle. Before anyone could discuss what to do next, a gentle knock echoed at the library door. One of the senior gardeners entered carrying a small wooden planter with both hands. He bowed respectfully before speaking. "Your Majesty, I thought you should see this immediately." He carefully placed the planter on the table. Inside it grew a single white lily unlike any flower they had seen before. Its petals shimmered faintly with silver along their edges, and tied gently around its stem with a narrow ribbon was a tiny handwritten note. Evelyn carefully untied the ribbon and unfolded the paper. The message contained only 6 words. "The door opens at first sunrise." Every person in the library looked instinctively toward the eastern windows, where the final light of day slowly disappeared behind the distant mountains. Knowing that dawn was now only one night away, the castle did not sleep that night. Long after midnight, Warm lights still glowed behind hundreds of windows as scholars searched forgotten shelves, royal guards quietly changed posts, and servants prepared for a sunrise no one fully understood. Blackthorn Castle had survived centuries of wars, treaties, and changing kingdoms, yet never before had so many people waited together for the first light of morning with equal measures of hope and uncertainty. Evelyn stood alone on the eastern balcony, wrapped in a simple wool shawl Margaret had insisted she borrow against the cool night air. Far below, the gardens shimmered beneath the moon, their unexpected white lilies pale silver light that made the pathways resemble quiet rivers. She had always believed her future would be simple: work honestly, help others when she could, build a peaceful life one ordinary day at a time. Somehow those ordinary dreams now felt unimaginably distant. Soft footsteps approached behind her. She did not need to turn around to know who it was. "You cannot sleep either?" Adrian asked gently. Evelyn smiled faintly. "I keep wondering if I will wake up tomorrow and discover all of this was only a strange dream." Adrian stepped beside her, resting his hands lightly upon the stone railing. "After sleeping through 50 years, I asked myself the same question this afternoon." They both laughed quietly, the gentle sound disappearing into the peaceful night. For a while they simply watched the stars above the valley. Finally Adrian spoke again. "May I tell you something I never told anyone?" Evelyn nodded. "During the years I was trapped between dreams, I was never completely alone." She looked toward him with quiet curiosity. "What do you mean?" Adrian studied the horizon before answering. "Whenever everything became dark, I would find myself walking through endless halls filled with closed doors. I always believed I was searching for the way home." He smiled thoughtfully. "Now I think I was searching for tomorrow." Evelyn remained silent, allowing him to continue. "Every time I thought I had reached the final door, someone would place fresh lilies beside it." His expression softened. "I never saw their face clearly, but I always felt safe." Evelyn lowered her eyes. "You still believe that person was me?" Adrian answered without hesitation. "I believe kindness leaves traces deeper than memory. Somehow yours reached places even time could not." Before Evelyn could respond, the heavy balcony doors quietly opened. King Lucian stepped outside, carrying 2 steaming cups of tea prepared in the old human tradition Queen Isabella had once enjoyed. Without ceremony, he offered one to Evelyn. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she said with genuine surprise. Lucian gave a small nod. Isabella always believed difficult conversations became easier over warm tea. The three of them stood together beneath the stars for several peaceful moments. Finally, Lucian broke the silence. "Miss Carter, there is something I wish to say before sunrise changes all of our lives again." Evelyn listened carefully. The ancient king looked across the sleeping kingdom stretching beyond the castle walls. "For 50 years I searched for extraordinary answers because I believed extraordinary problems demanded extraordinary solutions." His voice remained calm, yet every word carried quiet honesty. "Yesterday a young maid straightened a blanket because she thought someone looked cold." He turned toward Evelyn. "You reminded me that compassion often accomplishes what pride cannot." Evelyn felt unexpectedly emotional. "I only did what anyone should have done." Lucian smiled gently. Adrian quietly looked toward his father, clearly understanding the deeper meaning behind those words. A distant clock tower chimed 3 times, reminding them dawn continued drawing closer. Chancellor Rowan soon joined them, carrying a carefully rolled map and the weathered journal written by Queen Isabella. "Everything is ready," he reported softly. "The passages leading to the Hall of Origins have been opened for the first time in centuries." Lucian accepted the journal. "Any changes?" He opened the final page. The ink that had remained faded throughout the evening now appeared darker, as though freshly written. Beneath Isabella's last message, another sentence had quietly emerged. None of them remembered seeing it before. Rowan slowly read the words aloud. "Do not fear what waits beyond the hidden door. The greatest inheritance our family will ever receive is not power. It is the courage to choose kindness again." Silence settled gently around them. No one questioned how the new sentence had appeared. After everything they had witnessed, the impossible no longer seemed impossible. Evelyn looked toward the first faint hint of blue appearing above the eastern mountains. Night was beginning to surrender to morning. Far below, the silver-edged lily in the wooden planter slowly turned its blossom toward the approaching sunrise, and the small ivory key resting inside Lucian's coat pocket became pleasantly warm, as though quietly reminding every heart present that the next chapter of their journey would begin with the very first ray of dawn. The first ray of sunlight appeared above the eastern mountains with breathtaking stillness. spreading across the valley like liquid gold. Every person waiting inside Blackthorn Castle instinctively turned toward the horizon. No commands were given, no announcements were needed. They all knew the moment had arrived. King Lucian, Prince Adrian, Evelyn, Chancellor Rowan, Margaret, and a small group of trusted royal guards descended the oldest staircase beneath the castle, carrying only lanterns whose gentle light danced across walls carved centuries before the kingdom itself had taken shape. The air grew cooler with every step. Ancient stone replaced polished marble. The silence became so complete that even their footsteps seemed reluctant to disturb it. At the bottom of the final staircase stood an enormous circular chamber like anything had imagined. The Hall of Origins stretched before them beneath a vaulted ceiling covered with countless silver stars painted against deep midnight blue. 12 stone pillars surrounded the room, each carved with blooming lilies, flowing rivers and hands reaching toward one another instead of weapons. In the center rested a single arched doorway woven entirely with silver vines exactly as Adrian had described from his dreams. There was no visible lock, only a small opening shaped like the ivory key. Rowan quietly unfolded Queen Isabella's journal once more. "Every description matches," he whispered. Lucian removed the ivory key from his coat. The delicate engraving along its surface shimmered softly beneath the morning light, streaming through a narrow opening high above the chamber. He looked toward Evelyn before taking another step. "The journal never said who should place the key inside." Evelyn hesitated. "I do not think it belongs to me." Adrian gently smiled. "Perhaps that is exactly why it does." The ancient king studied both of them before quietly placing the small key into Evelyn's hand. It felt warm again, almost alive, but not frightening. Instead, it carried the same peaceful comfort she had experienced inside Queen Isabella's music room. Taking a slow breath, Evelyn approached the silver doorway. Her heartbeat echoed gently inside the vast chamber. She carefully lifted the key and guided it into the waiting opening. It fit perfectly. For one quiet moment, nothing happened. Then a soft golden glow traveled through every silver vine carved across the doorway. The 12 stone pillars answered with gentle light of their own, illuminating forgotten inscriptions that no one had noticed before. Words slowly appeared across the floor in elegant ancient to study them. His voice trembled with quiet amazement as he translated. "The kingdom endures where kindness is remembered." Adrian closed his eyes. "That sentence," he smiled softly. "I heard it many times while I dreamed." The silver doorway opened without a sound. No hidden machinery, no thunder. It simply welcomed them. Beyond it waited a small circular room filled with warm morning light despite having no visible windows. At its center rested a simple wooden table. Upon it lay a single crystal box surrounded by fresh white lilies that looked as though they had been placed there only minutes before. Lucian slowly approached and lifted the transparent lid. Inside rested no crown, no royal weapon, and no priceless jewel. There was only a carefully folded letter sealed with Queen Isabella's crest. The king opened it with hands steadier than anyone expected. He read silently for several moments before his expression softened in a way Evelyn had never witnessed before. Adrian looked toward his father. "May we hear it?" Lucian nodded and began reading aloud. "To my beloved family, if these words have reached you, then hope has already returned. Do not search this room for power because none was ever hidden here. Kingdoms spend generations protecting treasures that time eventually steals. The only inheritance worth leaving when fear offers an easier path. If Adrian stands beside you, then he has already learned that lesson through someone whose heart expected nothing in return. Honor that gift. Protect it. Let our family be remembered not for how long we ruled, but for how kindly we lived." Silence filled the chamber. Even the guards quietly lowered their heads. Margaret gently wiped away a tear before smiling through it. Rowan carefully closed the journal. "The greatest secret beneath this castle was never a weapon," he said softly. "It was wisdom." Lucian folded Isabella's letter with extraordinary care before placing it back inside the crystal box. He then turned toward Evelyn. "Miss Carter, my family owes you more than we can ever measure." Evelyn shook her head almost immediately. "I did not awaken a kingdom alone." Adrian smiled warmly. "Perhaps not." He looked around the peaceful chamber. "But you reminded it what it had forgotten." As the morning sunlight continued filling the Hall of Origins, the silver lilies carved into every pillar slowly lost their glow, their purpose finally fulfilled after centuries of waiting. Far above them, throughout Blackthorn Castle, every bell began ringing together once again. not with urgency this time, but with quiet celebration, carrying a single message across the valley that hope had not only returned to the royal family, but had found a home within every heart willing to choose kindness before power. The celebration continued throughout Blackthorn Castle long after the bells had fallen silent. Sunlight poured through stained glass windows, filling ancient halls with colors no one seemed eager to leave behind. Servants smiled more easily. Guards who had stood watch through endless quiet years finally allowed themselves hopeful conversations. In the royal gardens, the unexpected lilies continued blooming beneath the gentle morning breeze, drawing visitors from every corner of the kingdom. Yet for Evelyn, the greatest change was not found in prophecies or hidden chambers. It was found in the peaceful feeling that settled over every face she met. The fear that had surrounded her arrival had slowly transformed into gratitude. Days passed, and life inside the castle gradually discovered a new rhythm. Prince Adrian regained his strength one sunrise at a time, often walking through the gardens with Margaret, while learning about the 50 years the world had lived without him. King Lucian reopened sections of the castle that had remained closed since the prince's long sleep, allowing children from nearby villages to visit the royal library and gardens for the first time in generations. Chancellor Rowan carefully preserved Queen Isabella's letter inside the Hall of Origins, where it would remain not as a royal secret, but as a reminder for every future ruler. Evelyn asked for only one thing in return. She wished to continue helping wherever she was needed. At first, the palace staff protested. They insisted she should accept noble comforts after everything she had done. Evelyn simply smiled and quietly carried fresh flowers to the music room each morning, helped younger servants learn their responsibilities, and visited the castle kitchens to thank the cooks who had worked through countless sleepless nights. Before long, people stopped seeing those actions as unusual. They simply began following her example. One quiet afternoon, Adrian found Evelyn arranging lilies beside the fountain where they had first spoken after his awakening. "You never changed," he said with a warm smile. Evelyn looked up from the flowers. "Neither did you," Adrian laughed softly. "I hope that is true." They sat together beneath the old flowering arch while children from the nearby village chased butterflies across the gardens beyond. "Do you still wonder whether this was all a dream?" Adrian asked. Evelyn looked toward the castle towers glowing beneath the afternoon sun. "Sometimes," she smiled gently. "Then I remember how many people are smiling now." Adrian followed her gaze. "My mother believed kingdoms are remembered by the peace they leave behind." Evelyn nodded. "I think she was right." Nearby, King Lucian quietly watched the conversation from the palace balcony without interrupting. Rowan stepped beside him, carrying another collection of reports from across the kingdom. "The dreams have stopped," the Chancellor said. Lucian smiled faintly. "Because they were never warnings." Rowan closed the folder. "They were invitations." The king looked across the valley where travelers now approached Blackthorn Castle without fear, and the kingdom accepted. As evening approached, a celebration was held beneath strings of lanterns hanging throughout the royal gardens. Musicians played melodies once forgotten. Noble families dined beside villagers without ceremony. Laughter echoed through halls that had known only quiet patience for half a century. When the sun finally disappeared below the western hills, Adrian raised a simple glass of sparkling cider rather than wine. "To hope," he said. Evelyn gently lifted hers. "To kindness." Around them, hundreds of voices repeated the same words. The stars slowly appeared overhead, brighter than they had seemed in years. Deep beneath the castle, inside the peaceful Hall of Origins, Queen Isabella's letter rested safely within its crystal box. The silver doorway stood open now, no longer hiding wisdom from the world. Everything appeared exactly as it should, or so everyone believed. Just as the final lanterns were being extinguished across the gardens, a soft breeze drifted through the hidden chamber far below. The crystal box remained perfectly still, but somewhere beyond the open doorway, deeper than any royal map had ever recorded, another ancient bell rang only once. Its sound was quieter than before, almost impossible to hear. Yet in the darkness beyond the Hall of Origins, a second stone doorway slowly reflected a faint silver light across its surface. Unlike the first doorway, this one carried no lily. Carved into its center was the image of a single crescent moon surrounding an unfamiliar crown, and for the briefest moment a calm voice echoed through the empty passage, ancient, patient, and filled with quiet certainty. "The first promise has been fulfilled. Now the second may finally begin." The quiet celebration continued long after sunset, but early the following morning Evelyn found herself standing once again before the open entrance to the Hall of Origins. The castle had returned to its peaceful rhythm, yet one question remained in her heart. She remembered the faint voice that had echoed beyond the hidden chamber and the mysterious words about a second promise. When Adrian quietly joined her, he smiled as though he already knew why she had returned. Together they walked through the Hall of Origins, passing the crystal box that safely protected Queen Isabella's letter, until they reached the narrow passage beyond the first chamber. King Lucian, Chancellor Rowan and Margaret soon followed, carrying only a single lantern. They expected another secret waiting to be uncovered, but instead they discovered a modest stone arch carved with a crescent moon surrounding a simple crown. There was no keyhole, no ancient mechanism, and no magical inscription demanding another trial. Only one sentence had been carved into the stone. The second promise belongs to those who no longer seek miracles. Rowan carefully translated the ancient lettering before looking toward the others with quiet surprise. Lucian stepped closer and rested his hand against the doorway, yet nothing happened. Adrian tried next with the same result. Finally, Evelyn approached. Instead of searching for a hidden switch or another key, she simply pushed the old stone door with gentle care. It opened immediately. Beyond it stretched a peaceful garden hidden beneath an opening in the earth where warm sunlight reached the ground through natural stone above. Wildflowers covered the meadow, a narrow stream flowed gently between smooth rocks, and birds sang freely among ancient trees. At the center stood a single wooden bench facing a blooming white lily tree unlike anything they had ever seen. There were no treasures, no royal weapons, and no forgotten relics, only peace. Margaret smiled through quiet tears. "It feels like home," she whispered. Beneath the tree rested a weathered wooden plaque bearing Queen Isabella's unmistakable handwriting. Lucian carefully lifted it and began reading aloud. "If you have reached this place, then you have already found everything this family hoped to protect." The first promise restored hope. The second promises that hope must now become a way of life. Leave this place without searching for more secrets. There are no greater treasures than compassion freely given, forgiveness freely offered, and ordinary days shared with those you love. Silence settled over the hidden garden. Adrian closed his eyes and smiled peacefully. "This is where the dreams were leading me all along," he said softly. Rowan slowly nodded, not toward another mystery, toward an ending. Lucian folded the plaque carefully before turning toward his son. For the first time since Adrian had awakened, the ancient king looked completely free from the burden he had carried for half a century. He removed the Ashford signet ring from his hand and placed it into Adrian's palm. "The kingdom no longer needs a ruler searching for what was lost," he said. "It deserves one who protects what has been found." Adrian accepted the ring with humble gratitude before embracing his father. No prophecy announced the moment, no magic surrounded it. It needed neither. When they finally returned to Blackthorn Castle, Chancellor Rowan ordered every record concerning the Hall of Origins to be preserved exactly as Queen Isabella had intended. Future rulers would visit the chamber not to seek power, but to remember the responsibility that came with it. The hidden garden remained open as a place of reflection for every generation that followed. Over the months that came, the mysterious dreams disappeared from every corner of the kingdom. The strange celestial signs quietly returned to normal. The silver lilies blooming throughout the castle gradually became ordinary white flowers once again. Deep beneath the castle, the ancient bells never rang again. Blackthorn Castle slowly became known throughout the world not as the fortress where a prince had slept for 50 years, but as the kingdom where kindness had accomplished what strength never could. Evelyn never accepted a noble title despite countless offers. She continued greeting every servant by name, carrying fresh flowers to Queen Isabella's music room each week, and helping new staff members feel welcome just as Margaret had once welcomed her. Adrian often joined her, and together they transformed the castle into a place where nobles, scholars, travelers, and children from nearby villages gathered without fear. Years later, visitors no longer came asking to see the room where the prince had awakened. Instead, they asked to hear the story of the young woman who had simply straightened a blanket because someone looked cold. Every guide ended the story with the same words. The miracle was never the awakening. The miracle was that one ordinary act of kindness reminded an entire kingdom who they were meant to become. One peaceful spring morning, Evelyn and Adrian stood together beneath the eastern sunrise overlooking the valley where white lilies gently swayed in the breeze. The castle behind them was filled with laughter, music, and ordinary life. There were no unopened doors, no forgotten prophecies, no hidden promises waiting beneath the earth. Every question had found its answer, every heart had found its peace. As the first golden light spread across Blackthorn Castle, Adrian quietly took Evelyn's hand, and together they welcomed another beautiful ordinary day, knowing that after generations of waiting, the greatest happily ever after was simply a kingdom that would forever choose kindness before power, the end.